Yeah, one of the things that I've noticed in my years in this industry is we spend a lot of time looking at each other. And what I'm reminded of every Tuesday and Wednesday, all year long, is I sit with 50 20-year-olds and I talk to them about their media habits and their consumption. What I'm reminded of is the way people are actually consuming media is very different than I think the way the industry thinks about it. We focus on measuring and counting and paying and costs. And this is really about context. It's really about what's the message we're creating and how are they receiving the message and what is it driving in consumer behavior. And I think we lose that connection so often when we look at ourselves as an industry.
Sure, I believe so much that there is an amount of importance we need to place on content, and sometimes we miss all that, right? So we work off a base of assumptions when we come to these beat retreats. We talk about systems, we talk about data. Are those assumptions correct?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think we assume they're correct, or we assume that we have the answer to make them correct. But I look at behavior, and I think about what is our behavior as consumers, the people we're around behavior as consumers. And I can tell you that going back to my class setting, 90% of the students in my classes don't pay for their subscription. So what that says to me is the data that comes off of that info and the sharing that happens today in the streaming space, which, by the way, is impossible to navigate for a consumer. How can it be right? How can we base our assumptions on that? And we did a study at Engine that shows that even in CTV, people find half the commercials not to be contextually relevant. So when you think about those things, the answer is no.
Right, that's very insightful and very alarming. We sit here and talk about addressable advertising all day long at the beat retreats. Do we need to be looking at that differently?
Well, I think we make a number of assumptions as an industry that we just carry on, and inertia is a very powerful thing, and it's certainly relevant in the context of how an industry operates. But we need to be thinking about what really happens out there. The challenge for the industry, and will be a challenge forever, is that most of the companies that are doing this are evaluated financially, and costs become the gating factor. Everything in the value equation, from selecting an agency to placing your media to evaluating your media, is based on the cost versus a perceived value. And I think we're measuring the perceived value just from the wrong place. We're not really thinking about how are they really doing this. We're saying, well, we know they do X, Y, and Z, and I think that as an industry, we've got to go back to the roots of the industry and put a little gut into decision-making processes.
Sure, and when you say go back to our roots, you have great roots in television. And what are some lessons learned in linear that you think need to cross the chasm into digital?
Well, the thing that always made linear TV powerful is that the content was well received and was destination content. And what's happened is, the good news is that there's more and more content than ever was available. So the main lesson is that content and context will always matter no matter what we say. That being said, I would say a second piece of this from behind the screen is that relationships matter. Relationships matter because trust and good faith and people making decisions not just based on what a literal piece of paper IO says, but on what they feel based on all the knowledge they've accrued over the past 50 years, of an industry, or 70 years of an industry. And I think that's important, that we've learned those lessons from linear. In digital, we've learned how to count a lot of stuff. We've learned the importance of measuring the effectiveness, but the balance is still off.
Sounds right. Now, the other thing that in your recent Engine study, you talked about how much great content is out there. But you mentioned that less than half of the consumers can find the content that they're looking for. Is there any advice that you can give to all of these streamers to make it easier for the end consumers?
Well, I think today people pick content based on what gets put in front of them by social media, which is driven in large part by algorithms. And I think that the water cooler has been replaced by the social media website or algorithm. And I think that my suggestion would be that they listen to what they're seeing consumers react to, and not assume that just because they made it with grade A level actors and incredibly high production values, that it's going to be attractive to every audience. I like to come back to one of the favorite analogies of this industry, which is cats on skateboards. If you're a cat owner, Cats on Skateboards is the Super Bowl. And everyone forgets that because everyone says, well, my fancy TV show that was engineered with agents and actors and production values is better because it's better. And it's just not the case. And so you have to remember, ultimately, the word premium content is in the eyes and hearts of the consumer.